Welcome back. Now, in what has been seen as a victory for the marginalised and vulnerable groups last week, the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria ruled that the Department of Health must make public its COVID-19 vaccine procurement documents, including contracts and non-disclosure agreements. Now, this comes after the health advocacy group, Health Justice Initiative, approached the courts to demand transparency and accountability on the government vaccine procurement processes during the COVID-19 pandemic while using public funds. Now, to talk to us more about this outcome and what lessons should be drawn from the COVID-19 vaccine procurement, we're joined virtually now by Fatima Hassan, who is the Director of Health Justice Initiative, and Professor Alex van den Heever, who's Chair in the field of Social Security at Wits University School of Governance. Prof. Fatima, to both of you, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you.
Fatima, let me start with you. The last time we spoke, you had brought this action before the courts. So let's start with your reaction to the verdict at this point.
Thanks, Akina. And that was just a few weeks ago. So I think we're very encouraged that the judgment was quite expeditious. And obviously, we're really excited that the judgment affirms the public's right to know and that it upholds the principles of transparency and accountability. And it's ordered, basically, in summary, the Department of Health to make available all of the contracts within 10 days of the judgment being served. So we really look forward now to the Department of Health cooperating, making all those records available, and not continuing to uphold the secrecy that was demanded by very powerful pharmaceutical companies at the height of the pandemic. You'll remember at a time when there was so little supplies, and where basically the scarcity meant that the secrecy was traded for a few million doses of vaccine.
So, Fatima, just as a reminder for those who may not have been following the story, why was it important to actually hold government and those who were in charge of these procurement processes accountable?
So I think primarily for two reasons. The one was during a global pandemic, we saw an unprecedented level of secrecy in the procurement of vaccines, not just in South Africa, but globally. New types of non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality clauses were insisted upon by the pharmaceutical industry. And these are the very same or similar companies that will be procuring with our government in the future. And so that's the second reason. It's the precedent that's going to be created for procurement under national health insurance. And remember, all of this procurement involves significant amounts of public money. So primarily those two reasons is what was demanded of us in the middle of a pandemic, and there will be another pandemic, there could be another epidemic, there could be another disaster. We certainly don't want that type of procurement to take place. And then, of course, under the NHI. You must remember the global context when I say that South Africa wasn't alone in this, and obviously this judgment, is quite groundbreaking because it means that it could encourage other groups in other countries to demand the same type of disclosure. But at the time when these contracts were being negotiated, Transparency International estimates that currently, even now, less than 10% of the global contracts on vaccine procurement have actually been opened. Just this last week, Doctors Without Borders have now refused to sign a major agreement or procurement deal with a large pharmaceutical company on a very key essential HIV prevention drug because they are demanding secrecy from a humanitarian organization and an NDA from a humanitarian organization. So what we saw in this pandemic were these demands put not just on our government, but other governments in the global south, other governments elsewhere, many parts of Latin America as well, but also from initiatives such as Gavi or medical and humanitarian organizations as well.
Professor van den Heever, just staying with this point of accountability and transparency, some would say, well, this ruling has perhaps come too late. But is that the case, given that we still don't know to any certainty exactly what was spent on what and how much at this point? Or do we know? Have we consolidated all of those figures at this point?
No, we haven't. And maybe the first point is, I think it's unfortunate that we have to have a prior application to court in order for this information to be made public. There's no real reason, that's effectively what the courts are saying, for this information to be kept away from public view. Government should be the first to step up and be transparent about massive procurement processes that are in the public interest. We're in a situation where government has been effectively complicit in stealing money from the public and wasting taxpayers' money. So to force people to go to the courts to get this information out is unacceptable, not only in relation to vaccines, but all other procurement as well. But in relation to this, remember, government basically put itself in the position of being the sole purchaser of vaccines and the sole distributor. It created a single gatekeeper and effectively prohibited anybody else from participating and distributing. So when you take on that responsibility, we need to know exactly what you're doing when you concentrate power to that extent. And in this case, they also sold these vaccines on to the private sector as well. And the question is also whether or not the prices that they charged were lawful in terms of the single exit pricing regime. I'm very interested to see what exactly we paid for these and what was charged out as well. And we need to see basically end to end everything that was done in relation to these vaccines. And that was on top of the fact that the vaccine process itself was a disaster.
So, Prof. Heever, do we know how much of what was procured we still have, and how much of those vaccines, how many of that are still viable at this point?
I don't have the numbers. I know that there is a significant stock that hasn't been distributed, and that the expiry dates have effectively been shifted out to allow them to be used. But essentially, the demand is low. And at this point in time, a lot of people have been repeat infected and vaccinated. But there is not much public communication about the value of further vaccinations or whether or not we're getting updated vaccines. So there is very little public knowledge about what is going on.
Fatima, just coming back to your application and what you sought to do here, you've said that this case, of course, demonstrates, as Professor van den Heever also just touched on, that all governments should and can be held accountable when spending public funds. And this also includes the parties that they entered into subsequent contracts with. Now, is it in the public interest to know what was agreed to and to what extent? Because we've heard that perhaps it's not in our interest. So what precedent do you think all of this will set, not just for us, but for governments across the globe to be more transparent and more accountable?
Yeah, I'm always surprised that anybody would argue that, because we're dealing with health products. We're not dealing with luxury goods or, perfumes or medicine. So it's an essential intervention in the middle of a pandemic where you're trying to encourage millions and millions of people in our country to take the vaccine. And the more secrecy you have, the greater distrust you create, and it gives rise to anti-vaccine programs and anti-science programs. And we saw that with the HIV/AIDS crisis in our country as well. So let's just go back to the role of the pharmaceutical companies. What we had, and that's where I disagree with Alex, is that the reason why government became the default sole procurer was because the companies insisted on that. And embedded within those contracts are broad indemnification provisions and requirements, where these pharmaceutical companies during the COVID pandemic insisted that governments across the world were the sole procurers and that they wouldn't sell to anybody else because they wanted full indemnification against both civil and criminal liability, which explains why within 72 hours our parliament created this vaccine injury indemnification fund just for the COVID-19 pandemic and for these vaccines. The second thing I wanted to mention is that pricing is just one part of the information that we are interested in this contract. The important element is, did these companies use their negotiating power to leverage for themselves concessions in a separate private contract with a third party, which is another pharmaceutical company? And so that is the case of Johnson & Johnson. You'll remember that the resentment that South Africans feel, as well as our president, who's articulated this at multiple global platforms about being beggars during the time of the global pandemic, looking and searching for limited vaccine supplies, was that these companies insisted that in the case of South Africa, we weren't allowed to impose any export restrictions on vaccines filled and finished here in the Eastern Cape to benefit European customers. So we were waiting for vaccine supplies while vaccines that were filled and finished here in South Africa were sent to Europe while we were going through the Delta wave, because they were honoring those agreements that they signed in Europe first. So we'd like to see what the priority schedule was. We'd like to see what the provisions were for late delivery of supplies, because that is what happened in South Africa. We got a gush of supplies towards October, November 2021. And so we're now dealing with the situation of multiple issues, including distrust in the vaccination program, low uptake, the inability to procure new, more relevant or bivalent vaccines, and Alex can speak more on this particular issue. But also we have a situation where we then landed up at a time when we needed supplies, we didn't have them. And then we had too much supplies and our government didn't know how to deal with the excess stock. And so are there requirements or are there conditions that you can't sell them on to other countries, that you can't donate them to third countries? And so those are the issues of power that we're trying to address, because this case really is about the pharmaceutical industry, right? Are they going to come here under national health insurance or under any other pandemic or epidemic and insist on such NDAs and secrecy? I mean, that is unacceptable. That is a distortion of our democracy and the principles of transparency and accountability. If you want to procure in South Africa on health products, then you have to accept, that there are certain minimum norms and standards. And for us as health activist groups, the minimum norm and standard has to be transparency.
Well, Prof. van den Heever, as you respond to what Fatima said there, can you also please speak to us about how it was that COVID-19 vaccine, this pandemic, as it were, was used also, in terms of violating people's human rights, especially to poor global populations through vaccine inequity at that stage?
Oh, yeah, there's a number of things to say. So firstly, I would say South African government was complicit and willing partner in the secrecy, and that it needed to be addressed. I don't believe that they were everything was completely imposed on them, but it's absolutely critical that a private actor cannot place government in a position where it must actually uphold the company's private interests by in maintaining secrecy. The scandal, I think, in the South African context was that government wasn't ready in early 2021 to vaccinate, in particular, the healthcare workers from January. And that was the particular crisis. Everybody would predict we were going to have a glut by the end of 2021. But how does that help if 50,000 healthcare workers died during the process of that year? And it took a civil society action to get government, to move, to start the procurement process. So they only began in January 2021 to begin to enter into these negotiations. But what you also found at that time was we were going to be producing 300 million in fill and finish doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine during the process of 2021, all of which would be exported to the United States and Europe before they would begin to supply Africa. And that is part of the scandal. We were even a supplier, and yet supposedly we were blocked from being able to access what was being produced in South Africa. And the question is, what set of agreements also resulted in that? Because that's scandalous. They were prepared to distribute vaccines to South Africa only in 2022. And how did that help us? So all of our vulnerable population could have been vaccinated in the first quarter of 2021. That should have been our goal and our target. And both government and the industry let us down. So, yeah, we have to be in a position where we're more resilient in terms of being able to access vaccines and priority medications in times of crisis, and these will recur. So we can't be left in this position again, and we have to learn what was imposed on the South African government and see if our laws need to change. And also, governments are not totally invulnerable in relation to these companies. If they had imposed transparency from the beginning, we would have shamed these companies into behaving differently, but government didn't take that stance. So that's why I say they were willing and they were complicit in the secrecy, because it also suited players around government.
We are out of time. Fatima, I just need to ask you very briefly, has there been any indication from government side that they will be appealing this ruling?
As far as we know, we've just learned from media reports that they are studying the judgment. So we wait and see.
Well, that's where we'll leave it for this morning. Thank you so much, Fatima Hassan, Director of Health Justice Initiative, and Professor Alex van den Heever, a chair in the field of social security at Wits School of Governance. And they were talking to us there about the Gauteng High Court judgment against the Department of Health, ordering them, that is the government, to make public all the COVID-19 vaccine procurement documents, including the contracts and also non-disclosure agreements. And that has to happen within the next few days.